Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Welcome to the Wesley Theatre here in Sydney, where we're planning for later in the year to engage in a project with young people which enables them to understand what it means to live life to the full. Jesus promised that we have fullness of life, abundant life, life that is of quality. And I was on one occasion also leading a group of young people in thinking about the theme of following Jesus Christ. And it struck me as very interesting, the response of the young people to that question when they discovered that the title and name Christian is actually only found 3 times in the New Testament. It's found in Syrian Antioch, where it tells us in the Acts of the Apostles that this was the place where they were first known as Christian, people of the way. It comes when Paul is before King Agrippa towards the end of the Acts of the Apostles, and where he's challenged directly. And Paul is challenged about trying to persuade him to be or to draw him in to being a Christian. And the third occasion is, interestingly, when we note in 1 Peter that there were those who suffered as Christians. Immediately following Peter's great confession at Caesarea Philippi that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, we find the Lord himself teaches just what it means to live in the life of the kingdom and prefers that concept of following and discipleship. And it seems to me that that's an interesting one to explore together. There's a sense in which his message might appear contrary to what the expectations might be of the disciples. It's Peter who speaks up for the rest on many occasions, and here he does exactly that when Jesus talks about what might lie ahead in terms of suffering, death, and resurrection. It's Peter that stands up and says, "Oh, no. Surely this can't be." And of course, Jesus has to put him right. Jesus is concerned, we'd say in our own language now, Jesus is concerned, Peter's lost the plot here. He's really got confused, he's mixed, he's using language that he can't relate to. And so he says, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Jesus calls the crowd together. Now, he's been speaking to disciples, he's speaking to crowds at different points in Mark's gospel, but here he draws together the disciples and the crowd and spoke one of his strongest words. Those who would be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for me and the gospel will save it. Now, F.F. Bruce, a New Testament scholar, wrote a book on the hard sayings of Jesus. And he went through the gospel and he picked out the sayings that are tough. You know, when somebody asks you to go a mile, you have to go an extra mile. You give your shirt an extra shirt. You know, the kind of stuff that's at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere in the teaching of Jesus. But he says about this particular saying, no saying could be harder. That's Bruce, the New Testament scholar's conclusion about what Jesus says at this point. The phrase taking up one's cross has become, I think, unhelpfully popularly used. It's my cross in life I have to bear. You'll hear people say that. It's among one of the most wrongly applied texts, it seems to me, of the New Testament. All 3 of the synoptic gospels place these words after Peter's confession. They're used as, if you like, the first real warning about Jesus' impending passion. And that's why they fit very much in the Lenten period of study. And that's why we explore it on our journey to the cross, as we explore what it means to walk step by step on that journey with Jesus that will find its climax in those events that we call the Passion. What our text indicates is fundamental to the message of Jesus. And it occurs more frequently. In fact, it's about 6 or 7 occasions when these words in a different form are used about this discipleship taking up the cross. And they contain what I think I would call a watershed in the gospel. It would appear that everything that's gone before is leading to this. And everything that happens afterwards is a consequence of this declaration. It was Dietrich who wrote perhaps the finest book ever on discipleship, In the Cost of Discipleship. And probably of preachers that have preached on this theme, his is the most often quoted. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Amen. Now, most of us that might say that would probably feel that, we're saying it, but there's not much to demonstrate it. Bonhoeffer certainly can say it, and with retrospect we can say, gosh, he did. That real commitment and all that means. When John Stott came to the end of his life, the last serious extended written piece he wrote was a book called The Radical Disciple. And as one who'd been a conservative in terms of the way he understood the New Testament all his life, he put those two words together because he believed they fundamentally belonged together. A direct challenge to be serious about the teaching of Jesus. Stott suggested to his readers, our common way of avoiding radical discipleship is to be selective, choosing the area of which commitment suits us and staying away from those areas where it might be costly. The writer is correct in drawing our attention to the type of selectivity that exists in all our discipleship. David Watson, that great Anglican who died all too young, wrote an outstanding book on discipleship and suggested that theme sums up the way of Christ and his plan for the world, and goes on to write these words. Yet for all its brilliant simplicity, it's the one approach that most Western churches have neglected. Instead, we have reports, commissions, conferences, seminars, missions, crusades, reunion schemes, liturgical reforms, the lot. But very little attention has really been given to the meaning of discipleship. I wonder why it is that so many Christians have largely neglected this critically important area in the teaching of Jesus. Have we become satisfied by merely being church members, seat fillers, song singers, listeners to sermons, even born-again Christians, spirit-filled charismatics? Jesus didn't ask us to do any of those things. He said, if you want to follow me, don't just go to church, don't just sing the songs, live it out. So what you say to each other, what you say in the public space, the discipleship of your life, that's the acid test of being a Christian. That's the Jesus way. And it's challenging. It's so challenging. If we're sitting there thinking this is for somebody else, you ain't got it. The message is for all of us, that disturbance that says our discipleship is proved not by whether we're in tune with the song, but whether we're in tune with the message. Not whether we're just in tune with the message, but whether the message is being lived out day by day in our lives. Back to Watson, who wrote, if we're willing to learn the real meaning of discipleship and actually become disciples, the church in the West would be transformed. And the resultant impact on society would be staggering. Now, you might be tempted to conclude that's a staggering claim. But one only has to consider the impact that the gospel had when let loose on those early days of the Christian church. They were changed from being a timid group of actually men and some women into something that is a community of men and women on fire. The impact of the revolution of Christ is to bring men and women to take seriously his call. We must consider the influence of Christianity in the poorer parts of the world. You see, this kind of language sits more comfortably for the African Christian. Just think of what it's like to be a Christian in Nigeria tonight. knowing that a group of common have literally burned your friends alive. You know, nice songs don't matter to them. They don't spend the time saying we don't like the church leadership, our meetings aren't right. They have friends dying for their discipleship, dying for belonging to Christ. And that really is not an isolated case. Around the world, that story can be told again and again. And I wish I was talking about something that was happening 500 years ago, but I'm not. The story is recorded of a young communist, you know, who threw out this challenge to Western Christians in this way: the gospel is a much more powerful weapon for the renewal of society than our Marxist philosophy. But all the same, it will be us that beat you in the end. We communists don't play with words. We're realists. And seeing that we're determined to achieve our object, we know how to obtain the means. How could anyone believe in the supreme value of this gospel if you don't practice it? If you don't spread it? And if you sacrifice neither time nor money for it? We believe in our communist message, and we're ready to sacrifice everything, even our life. But you people are afraid to even soil your hands. Now, I have to say those are hard words, and they're not entirely true. But the challenge from the voice of the communist is very powerful. In recent weeks, we have been dreadfully reminded of the power of execution, with the thought that there are still people in the world that feel justice can be meted out by taking people's lives. And if I ever hear Christians kind of agreeing with that, oh gosh, do I feel sad. But isn't it interesting that when Jesus chose to give the motive of following him, he used the public execution motive, following the way of the cross. The cross isn't a badge, it isn't a symbol, it was a sign of public execution in the days of the Roman power block. And that became the honored, the revered, the embraced sign of Christianity. Some of the disciples would prove it in their own lives within a generation. Let me use that text and open up three, what I hope are natural aspects that fall out of these words. First of all, you certainly can't save your own life. We may want to save our own life, but we can't do that, at least in terms of eternity and the kingdom values of Jesus Christ. For those who want to save their life will lose it. We live in a world where people are encouraged to take control of their situation. And we at Wesley Mission use that understanding of taking control of your situation in many different areas. I'll give you one example. In terms of financial debt and the fact that people get themselves into a situation of being able to handle their finances and their circumstances, we even use the title, "In Charge of My Money." So what we're doing is encouraging people to look very carefully at their circumstances and take some control and power over those circumstances. But when it comes to the deepest challenges of all, we know that there are some things that are actually outside of our influence by ourselves. I recall not long ago an adult speaking to a young child said, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" Don't children love that question? Does that mean I'm not grown up? Does that mean that you need to know that at this point in time? And usually it has some response. Now, there is a time where the question is helpful because there's an answer to be given. Sometimes the question is asked of someone at the tender age of about 9. What are you going to be when you grow up? When most adults, when you talk to them, there are a small number of people that actually follow through right from here to the end and become what they wanted to be there. Thankfully, many things happen to people and they're interrupted and direction changes in all ways. The question is asked in such a way that might suggest that the decision and the answer and the conclusion is all in the child's hands. If only it was. An early memory in pastoral ministry that I had was visiting a successful businessman who suffered a heart attack. At the hospital, he said these words to me. I wrote them down at the time. Keith, this is the first thing that has happened to me in my life that I didn't make happen. It was a person who had become, because of his circumstances, his giftings in some ways, and his life, he really believed he ran his life. Winston Churchill once said this: I've never accepted what many people have kindly said, namely that I inspired the nation in a race drilling around the globe that had a lion heart. I had the fortune of being called upon to give the roar. The great Baptist preacher, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, in one address said this: one might better try to sail the Atlantic in a paper boat than to get to heaven with good works. It's very important that we recognize that we cannot save ourselves. If salvation is by works, what hope is there for the angry young man or the woman in a confused state? What hope is there for those who are locked up for their own protection? What hope is there for the millions who die of hunger, whose total concentration from the moment they live to the close of the day is, will I have enough food today to survive? I'm grateful that Jesus says we can't save ourselves. Secondly, we can lose our lives and find ourselves saved in Christ. Now, I'm not into all the formulas about all of this. I'm not going to say it doesn't interest me, but it's not our priority. But losing our lives and being found in Christ is the glorious experience and purpose of the Christian life. You have that wonderful verse in Galatians: I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I that live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who gave himself for me. See, the significance of this text tonight lies in the most profound paradox, that the way to self-fulfilment is through the way of self-denial. John Calvin treated self-denial as the summary of the Christian life. It was he who concluded we are God's. Therefore, let his wisdom and will preside in all our actions. We are God's. Towards him, therefore, as our only legitimate end, let every part of our lives be directed. Back to Bonhoeffer. Now Bonhoeffer's context is very different. He's not writing what is a great treatise on the theme of following and discipleship. He's writing those powerful words. You've never read them, you ought to. Letters and papers from prison. It was in the cell as he awaited the possible end for which would be his just before the end of that war, for his part in collusion in a plan against Adolf Hitler. And those letters and papers are interesting because they're a collection. Some of the most beautiful are to his wife, who of course he was separated from. And if you've never read his letter at Christmas, you should read it. But he wrote these words as he awaited an inevitable end. Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, so God, I am thine. Not everyone who's understood this truth has necessarily been any great giant or martyr in the Christian story. Think of the woman who is journeying through her life, raising children in a home with all the challenges of not having enough money to be able to live day by day. She's there with the giants. Think of the man who is faithfully devoted to his wife, who's been diagnosed with dementia. And day by day, he is doing for her all the things that he never believed he would ever have to do. You see, he was the one, everybody said, your wife does everything for you, but now the tables are turned. And his care and compassion, she's up there, he's up there. with those saints. Think of the person whose obedience is not only right, but enormously costly. We lose ourselves when we're willing to be caught up into something greater and grander and bigger and more significant and more important than ourselves, and nothing could be more important than the cross. So be caught up in it. Throw your lives on Christ. Decide that will be the way of your living. You don't know what that could possibly mean. But I know that the young person and the man and the woman who is prepared to follow Christ with that kind of intensity will enjoy all the fruits of eternal life. And then thirdly, the secret is discipleship. We're called to be graduates in this school of discipleship. I like that, because it means we're still training. Nobody has actually got there. We're still marching on that march. We're still walking that way. We're still following one who is ahead of us. I love those pictures. I haven't the time to do this tonight, but they're the Gospels where you see Jesus is on the road ahead of the disciples. I like that. I like to think that they're tripping over themselves to keep up with him. That they're trying to have a conversation and they're out of breath because here he is. He's determinedly, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, setting his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem. He is marching towards the cross. The text seems to indicate that a correct answer to the question, who is Jesus, is then helpful in helping us to answer that question of who am I? We are disciples if we follow Jesus. We're learners in a school that it will take a lifetime to complete. And here's the good news. The only one that does your mark sheet is God. Not the preacher or the elder or the steward, but God himself. And you can know this night with certitude that the divine tick is yours if you lose yourself in him and give yourself unstintingly to his purposes. There's an interesting word for those of us who are concerned about offering the good news of salvation. For those who are busy themselves in wanting to get saved. If you look down church history, there have been so many people who've given their whole attention to this process of how do I get saved? And you know, Jesus did not give a doctrinal pattern. It's a shame. He didn't say, I'll tell you how you get saved, A, B, C, D, E. He just said, get lost. And then you'll get found. Follow. And you'll discover. And the trouble is that this very simple explanation of what it means to be living in that salvation is profound and takes a lifetime of understanding and discovering. This text offers a stern warning about the preoccupation in wanting to get yourself saved. But when you throw yourself into him, then salvation is yours. This call of Jesus cuts right across so many of the approaches and the conventional wisdom of our day. It cuts across some popular piety, indeed natural inclination of many. You know, I've never out. I thought it works tonight. I received this letter from a well-known publishing company. It begins, Dear Mr. Garner, there is a possibility, and in brackets, for the moment I say no more than a possibility, that you could be one of the winners in our greatest ever prize draw. First, and it goes on and talks in this way, and it said, you'll notice on the card there is a telephone symbol. I'm sending you this now because the procedure for notifying winners has been carefully devised to minimize the risk of hoax messages with all the distress and disappointment that causes. Please notify that under no circumstance do we telephone winners. It goes on and on and on. Then it says, you will also see that there's a lapel badge attached. If you win one of the top prizes, you'll receive an official invitation to a celebration party. This will be held in the last week of August at a top hotel at our offices. I'm not reading any more detail than that. But I tell you that, I've got one of these. It's very important that you wear this because we want to identify you as a guest of honor when you come to this particular place. Finally, it says, look out for the brown envelope. Well, that doesn't get me very far, does it? It will reach you shortly. You'll recognize it at once. It'll have a green foil pouch showing through the front. Be ready to act right away as soon as it arrives to make most of the chance that you have of winning this prize. Now, you see, I find that interesting because I think that's the way the world attracts people. But saying, if you want, this is what you'll get. Gosh, Jesus didn't send letters out like this. When Jesus was giving his greatest ever offer, when he was calling people into the way of eternity, what did he say? If you want this eternity, you better be willing to die for it. You better be willing to go the way of the cross for it. An Anglican bishop of Tehran worked for 30 years in Iran before the revolution broke out in February 1979. About a year later, an attempt was made on the life of the bishop, but he escaped. However, in May of the same year, their son, Baran, was murdered on the outskirts of the city. Margaret, the bishop's wife, wrote this: I think we've got to be quite clear that following Jesus is not necessarily going to be easy, not necessarily safe. And unless we're ready at the time of difficulty to continue following him, then whatever we say at other times means nothing. Discipleship is deciding to follow Christ and his way. It's very easy to say some things and not be sincere about them. But to be really sincere will show when the troubles come. When the storm comes is the time you really have to mean business. And we'll let the bishop's wife have the final word. Amen.